Hello, fellow classmates, teacher, and random people on the internet. Today, we're going to try to cover the 6 reasons of Confederation.
No, try.
I'm Keana.
I'm Annabelle.
And I'm Angelina.
Now let us begin. Reason 1. Confederation is when 2 or more groups come to a mutual agreement and join forces, much like this project. Canada East and West formed a coalition in order to eradicate political deadlock. 2 parties from Canada East and West formed a legislative assembly. The coalition government in power had a difficult time getting a strong enough majority to pass the legislation. Disagreements and political deadlock in the government were common. This is because Canada East and West would have many arguments and would rarely agree with each other. George Brown from the Reform Party and John A. Macdonald from the Liberal Conservative Party, both leaders of Canada West, were enemies. In 1864, George Brown announced that he was willing to work with the people he did not agree with. This resulted in the Great Coalition. Reason 2. Obstacles that separated the United Province of Canada from the Atlantic colonies included the mountains in Gaspé, the northern part of the state of Maine, and the St. Lawrence River, since it froze each winter, stopping water transportation between the colonies. An intercolonial railway would increase trade with the colonies as well as speed up mail delivery. In case of war, especially attack by the United States, a railway would allow troops to move from one colony to another swiftly with ease. Unfortunately, by 1860, the Grand Trunk Railway, which used to go from Sarnia in Canada West to Rivière-du-Loup in Canada East, ended up bankrupt. The Great Western Railway, which ran from the Niagara River to Windsor, also started to develop financial trouble. Railway building in the British North American colonies came to an abrupt stop. However, some politicians and businessmen were beginning to think of a new country united by a railway. Reason 3.
The Reciprocity Treaty was from 1852 to 1865. Agricultural products, raw materials, and other items could be sold across the British North America borders to the United States under the Reciprocity Treaty. In 1865, United States canceled this treaty. The United States ended this treaty because they felt like Canada was the only nation that was benefiting from it. Although free trade between British North America and the US has ended, people in the colonies of British North America started to join together so they could trade amongst themselves. They hoped that this would increase the economy.
Reason 4.
The American Civil War was between the northern and southern states. The Southerners took advantage of Canadian territory to try and attack the northern states. The northern states accused the British colonies of trying to help the Southerners in the war, although the Southerners were trying to run away from the northern troops while this was going on. The US and British North America's relationship wasn't very stable because the British supported the South more. The British were afraid of the Americans, though, because they thought that the Americans would expand to their territory, which did happen in 1866. In 1866, the Fenians made armed raids towards the British North America colonies. But who were the Fenians? The Fenians were Irish Catholics in the US who wanted to try and eradicate British rule. Though they couldn't attack Britain, though, so they attacked the Northern American colonies, which was close enough to them. Manifest Destiny occurred directly after the Civil War. Americans had already obtained lands from Spain, Mexico, France, and Great Britain. The people of British North America were concerned of their western lands. They thought that Americans would take over their land. The Americans in the Red River settlement wanted to join the United States. There was already a trade between the Red River and St. Paul, Minnesota. There was a growing problem, though. The people of British Columbia were concerned that they would be taken over by the U.S., while the American miners came over during the late 1850s and early 1860s during the Big Gold Rush. There was a lot of trade between British Columbia and San Francisco. British Columbia took more of a liking to California than eastern British North America, though. People in the British North America colonies were so concerned that Americans would try and take over. They wanted to unite with British North America colonies so they could at least try and defend themselves.
Reason number 5.
Great Britain's attitude towards the colonies in North America began to change in the mid-1860s. Opinions were divided to whether colonies were a benefit to Great Britain. Colonies were a good source of raw materials and a marker for manufactured goods. People also believed colonies could provide huge profits. Colonies would provide opportunity for British people to immigrate. If they were to move to a British colony, they would remain a British citizen. British colonies would provide soldiers and military bases in the event of war. Various British politicians believed that the colonies would be a burden on British taxpayers. Politicians wanted colonies to become independent so they could pay for their own government and defense. Many British North Americans were still intensely loyal to Britain. They were aware that they needed Britain's support. These loyal people would view Confederation more favorably if Great Britain wanted Confederation. The British governors and colonies of British North America were told to encourage Confederation.
Reason 6.
The supply of available and good farmland in Canada West was diminishing. Canada West looked to the lands to the east, which is now present-day Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, as new possible areas of settlement. Americans were also thinking to move into these western lands. If the BNA colonies were to join together and go to these western lands, they thought they could settle the land before the Americans did.
Colonial politicians negotiated the terms of Confederation at the Charlottetown Conference and the Quebec City Conference. Yet, the First Nations were not invited. They were not represented in any way and were often excluded from political actions. Politicians would often dismiss the First Nations and not pay attention to their wishes. The Indigenous people were constantly dehumanized and stripped from their rights, just for their culture.
When the idea for Confederation was originally introduced to the people of Canada East, they didn't want to join because they wanted to keep preserving their identity. In 1867, Canada East finally agreed to working with Confederation because they would actually be represented in the government.
The British people are only impacted positively because they came up with the idea of Confederation. George Brown and people who supported him didn't see many drawbacks but more advantages. The advantages they saw in this were that Confederation will allow better military protection against Americans and others. Because there were so many more advantages, 54 of the 62 members of the Legislative Assembly from Canada West voted in favor of the Confederation initiative.
Was by the mountains in Gaspé.
And I'm Angelina. Politicians wanted...
Today, we are going to...
Then the text comes
Shut
up.
Shut! I'm Keana.
In 1867, Canada East finally agreed to Oh crap, I accidentally started recording. Yo, it's recording.
Keana's a poo-poo head.